Okay guys, we're here today with my neighbor's 2000 Honda Civic. This has the B16A, the JDM version of that engine in it. We had already worked on the throttle position sensor on the back. There's a previous video up for that. We're going to go after the water pump today. What we've got going on is he's got a small, you see right there, a small fluid leak that gets worse when the car is running. We can't tell exactly where it's coming from. We're pretty sure it's going to be coming from behind the water pump and then draining down and then leaking towards the front and dripping there. What we're going to have to do to get at this today is we actually have to take the valve cover off. We have to take the front timing belt cover off, and I'm going to show you how to go about that. And in the process of that, we're going to have to loosen the alternator, which unfortunately with this B16 is way back in the back here. I've taken it loose already. It's not too hard to get to. I'm going to show you how we're going to go about it. So the first thing we're going to go after is loosening the alternator and taking this front timing belt plate off of it. Okay, we're looking at underneath the engine now. Through the wheel well, we have the driver's side front wheel off, and you can see the alternator there. You see that bolt on the bottom. We have to go after that and loosen it, and loosen the one on the top. The next thing that we're going to have to do is we have to take the crank bolt out and get the balancer off. Once that comes out, then the timing belt plate, the cover, has to come off as well. So I'm going to go after this lower alternator nut now, get the top one, get the belt off, and then we're going to take that balancer off. It's a 19 millimeter on the front of that. Those things are notoriously tight on Hondas. If yours has never been taken off, you may need the tool. You see how it's kind of hexagonal around your balancer there? You have to put the tool in there to lock that up, and then pretty much use a breaker bar, maybe even heat, to get your crank bolt out. We've had the crank bolt off of this car before. I can get it off with my impact, so I'm not too worried about it, but you may run into that issue with your car. So I'm going to back up and get those out and show you what we got when we're finished. I'm going to catch you up on where we're at now. The first thing that has to happen is that your valve cover does have to come off of this type car to get to your timing belt. So spark plugs have to come out and the valve cover has to come out. The balancer on the front is now off the car. It's a 19 millimeter bolt. We just discussed it earlier. That could be a kind of a problem. One thing that happens with this car that I wasn't expecting is the keyway for the balancer and your belt gear are in two different pieces. So when you take the balancer off, half of that key, the key comes out. And so make sure that you keep up with that small key, because you're going to need that to put it back in the car. So we've got to this point now. What we have to do now is, it's kind of hard to show you, try to get my finger back here. This is the tensioner that the timing belt's coming across the top here. Try to show you a little better. Okay, yeah, this is the tensioner. We have to loosen that to take the tension off of the belt, and then we're going to slide it off. What I've done is I've rotated the engine to top dead center. You can see the keyway here is straight up and down, and if you look on the front of the cam gears, they have up and up. And then I went an extra step, since we're not actually replacing the timing belt on this car, as I marked the tooth and the location on the cam gear on each one, so we know that we put everything back exactly like it's supposed to be. So after this belt comes off, you don't want anything to rotate the engine. This is a interference engine, and that means that the valves can't hit the piston. So if the cams are out of time with the crank and you start spinning things around, you're liable to bend one of your valves, and that can actually ruin your entire engine. So I'm going to get up underneath here. I'm going to see if I can videotape or some of this getting that tensioner loose for you. All right, we're looking from the bottom now. I'm going to try to show you the best I can. This part here, that's where your crank bolt goes, and your harmonic balancer or your dampener goes on this part here. This is your tensioner. It puts tension on that belt. It's kind of hard to see in the lighting we got. I'll try to show you. Okay, you can see behind the tensioner there, you see that spring. That is actually holding tension on the belt. What we're going to try to do is just loosen the bolt on the front and take some of the tension off, just enough to slip it off without even bothering taking the spring off. So I'm going to loosen that large, it looks like a 14 millimeter on the front of that, get it off, or get it loose, and see if we can move that tensioner to the right, and it should take tension off of the belt. All right, I did get that loose. What I did is I did loosen the nut in the middle, and then the spring here, sorry about the camera angles, the spring here did have to come off the top. Once the tension was off of that, I slipped it off of the bottom gear here, and then off of the water pump there. I'm not even, since we're not changing the belt, I'm not even going to bother taking it off of the cams on top. It doesn't matter if you do, but I'm just going to save myself a step. So there are, I believe, only 3 bolts for the water pump on this car. There's one on the bottom, one kind of in the back, and one more towards the top. 3 10mm. We're going to get that off right now and take a look at it, see if it looks like the bearing might have been going bad in that. It is definitely leaking right there underneath the water pump. As you can see, it's on the different parts of the engine there. So I'll come back when I get that off and we'll give it an inspection. Alright, it's the next morning. It was getting a little dark last night, and we had a antifreeze spill after we pulled the old water pump off to go ahead and clean up and get dried before we get back on this. So this is the water pump that came off. This is not OEM. From what he tells me, it doesn't have too terribly many miles on it, so that just shows you how much better OEM parts are, because this has failed. You see this part here, that's where it was leaking from. That is called a weep hole, and what happens is when the bearing in this starts to go bad, it will actually intentionally start leaking from weep holes that are inside of the channels. So it alerts that you have a problem. It starts to drip out, and that's what he had going on. Now you can't really hear this bearing that it failed, but if you hold the casing for the water pump and you spin it, you can feel it, a vibration as it turns, and that's not good at all. This is actually Honda OEM that he's bought to replace this, and that's what we're going to get on here now. Just to show you also, this thing bolts on. There are actually 5 bolts that hold this to the engine block. Here, here, and here. That is not a the one at the top is not actually going to the engine. It's for something else. All right, so we're going to get this put back on. I'm going to see how much of this I can video for you, this tight little engine compartment. So let's get on that. All right, we have the water pump back reinstalled. The torque spec on those 10 millimeter bolts are 109 inch-pounds or 9 foot-pounds. Just about every 10 millimeter bolt on the front of that engine is at that torque spec. One thing to keep in mind, we did find one nut that was shorter than the rest, and it's going to be the one that goes in this top left corner here. All the rest of them are the same size. So there's 2 on the top, 1 on the side, and then 2 more on the bottom. Okay, once that's on, now our concern is going to get the timing belt back on the car. How it's going to work is this timing belt goes over the top of the 2 cams here. It goes around the water pump on the right side, and then under the water pump, and then over the balancer, which is right there, goes around like that, and then it comes out the bottom, and then it goes around the gear on the bottom of the crank. Our main concern is that we have to have that timing belt lined up, both of the cams and the crank, in the exact right tooth spot. If you're off even one tooth here, that you can, it's not going to hurt anything, but it's going to hurt the performance of your car. So we want to make sure we have that right. Before we took that timing belt loose, I already had the car at top dead center. So both of the cam gears, they have marked on the spoke here, it has the word up. So you have to make sure that those are both at exactly 12 o'clock. And then on your gear on the okay, and then the gear that's on the front of your crank here also has to be at the 12 o'clock position. There are marks on the oil pump itself, and there is a gear that has a triangle in it out of all of these gear teeth, and that's the one that points to the marks that are on the oil pump. You can also tell with your keyway will also be at the 12 o'clock position. So once you have all that set, we're going to lay the timing belt over the 2 cam gears, come around the water pump, over the tensioner, and then it's going to come around here and go back up to the front cam. So we're going to get that put back like it's supposed to be, and we'll come back and show you when we're finished. All right, we got this back where it belongs. If you remember, I showed you where I put the mark on the belt and then on the tooth for the belt, and then on the part where it goes in the cam. I make sure I had those two back exactly so I know that this is set where it's supposed to be. And again, it goes down over the inside part of the water pump, loops over, goes over the top of the tensioner, and then around the crank gear, and then back up this side. All right, there's a spring for the tensioner. It's going to be really hard to show you. Okay, this is where the spring hangs right here, and what it does, it attaches to the bottom of the tensioner, and then you pull the spring up and you hang it back on this little knob here. And what that does is put tension on it, the right amount of tension. And once you have everything back together the way it goes, what you're going to do to set the tension correctly is you're going to give the engine like you move it just a little bit counterclockwise. This engine rotates counterclockwise, and when that happens, that's going to pull everything tight. And once it's tight, we're going to lock down that bolt on the front of the tensioner. We're going to do that right now. Okay, so what I've done is I put the crank bolt back onto the crank just temporarily so I can actually rotate the engine with a wrench. And all I'm going to do is I'm going to rotate it just a little bit counterclockwise. And when I do that, you're going to see that belt tighten up to the tension that it's supposed to be at. All right, here we go. Give it a little bit of a turn. And everything, sorry about that, everything kind of starts to pull together, and right there is the right tension for the belt. So now I'm going to go back to that 14mm nut that's on the front of the tensioner and lock it down so it can't move anymore. Alright, so the tensioner's back set where it's supposed to be and tightened down, and once you get to that point, the amount of tension that's supposed to be on this belt, you should be able to turn it to 90 degrees from where it's at, and it really can't go any further than that. And that's exactly where we're at on this car. It'll go 90 degrees either way. And so that's the perfect tension. Now the next step we're going to do, see our marks have moved because we had to turn it just a little bit to make sure that we had the tension right. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to rotate the engine 2 or 3 times and get all these marks back up to where they were at. And after rotating a few times, if everything comes back up and it's in the same spot that it was when you began, then you know that you have your teeth right on the belt. So we're going to back up and do that right now. All right, we got the valve cover back on, the spark plug's back in, and the spark plug wires. If I'm not mistaken, the timing on this engine is 3421. That should be the number 1. This should be the number 3. Comes off of here, then it goes around counterclockwise. So it's 3421, and you just make sure you have all those back in the right position. When you get all these bolts back on, you want to work inside to out and just get them good hand snug. You don't want to put the gorilla fist on that one either. All right, so moving right along, we're going to get the harmonic bouncer or the dampener back on the front, and then get the timing cover plate back on it. Then we're going to be ready to get the fluid back in the car, crank it up, and see if we got that leak taken care of. All right, we're ready to put the timing belt cover back on. This guy here, it's just going to go around that bottom of the gear. It has a couple of bolt holes. These are kind of funny looking bolts. They have necks or shoulders on them, and those are the ones that will hold that on. So all we're going to do is just sneak this back into position. There is a gasket on the back of it. These things are old and really don't do much good at this point, but we're going to get it back where it belongs and get it tightened back up against the side of the engine. Okay, putting the dampener, bouncer, whatever you want to call it, back on here with this part here. You see the keyway at the top. That's where the key goes in that I talked about. There was actually 2 pieces on this car, so you want to make sure that that's back where it belongs, and that you have the bouncer or dampener slip back over in the right place. Once you get it to this point, then you just put your crank bolt back in and you just run it down with a impact wrench, and it'll go seat back to where it belongs. Let's move along. All right, the car fired right back up. We got everything put back together. We are letting the system bleed, get the fluid back in it, but the timing's right, it's cranked up, everything's running really smooth. We don't have any leaks coming from the oil pump any longer. I think we're going to call this a win. Appreciate you guys watching. I'll check you out on the next one.